Imagine spending years behind bars for a crime that you did not commit. Imagine the truth being ignored, your name being forgotten, and the system feeling stacked against you. We are going to speak directly to exonerees and experts who are working to right the wrongs of our criminal justice system. From false confessions to misconduct, we are going to uncover the truth behind wrongful convictions and what happens after freedom. In 2019, the show When They See Us shook the world. It told the story of 5 young boys who were wrongly convicted of a brutal crime that they did not commit. It was an eye-opening moment, but for those who lived it, wrongful conviction is not just a one-time tragedy. Through the voices of people who lived it, we'll explore the cracks in the justice system and what it means to survive them. Do you mind giving me an introduction and telling me more about yourself?
Um, well, I spent most of my career as a journalist. I spent a lot of it investigating wrongful convictions. When I left the Chicago Tribune in 2008, I worked for an Innocence Project in California as a researcher. And ultimately, in 2012, when the National Registry of Exonerations went online, I became the senior researcher there, and I've been there ever since. And so my job there is to gather data and information and write up cases of wrongful conviction for the National Registry.
Can you describe your role as an investigator within the wrongful conviction unit at the Legal Aid Society?
Sure. So my role as an investigator in wrongful conviction is to act as support to the attorneys and speak to witnesses, find witnesses, and also review documents in this unit because the cases are old and have already been to trial and also probably numerous court appeals. We have a lot of paperwork, and we receive a lot of that paperwork through the Freedom of Information law. So some of my job is uploading those documents and reviewing them, looking for investigative leads. An investigative lead could really be anything from a name or an inconsistency in the paperwork that might indicate prosecutorial misconduct or police misconduct. So those are some angles we take often, and then usually it's re-speaking to witnesses, re-interviewing them, depending on the goals of the case.
What inspired you to pursue a career in law, and how did you become involved in wrongful conviction cases?
So the way that I got involved in law was really by accident. My family had no experience in law, and in college I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then I thought back on an incident that occurred when I was in high school. I took the AP history exam, and the proctor shortened our time by 45 minutes. And none of us in the room were able to complete the exam. And he was basically said, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about it afterwards. So even though I was in high school, I went to the library and I researched, and I brought a petition on behalf of myself and my fellow students to have them re-give us the AP exam. And I actually won. And it was the first time they ever had to re-give the AP exam. So in college, I was like, hey, maybe I should be a lawyer. Since I kind of won I had no idea what I was even doing, But did the research. I was able to prove that, they were wrong and should have given us the time. And that really kind of set me on that path. I always liked to read, always liked to write. I was an English major, and I had a BA in Psych and a BA in English, and basically that's law. When you combine psychology with English, you get law. And so I loved it from the minute I went into law school. A lot of people hated law school. I love law school. And I just really enjoyed the challenge. The way that I got involved in wrongful conviction is in the 90s, I had a very, very busy criminal defense practice. one of the largest criminal defense practices in the city. And a judge, the administrative judge of Queens, contacted my office and asked to speak to me about a case of a young man that had written a letter to the courthouse, a guy named Angelo Martinez, saying that he was innocent for this crime that had been committed 18 years earlier, and he was looking for a pro bono attorney. So he was Dominican, and the judge knew that I was Dominican, and so he thought of me. And at first I was like, yeah, I don't think so. I'm not going to do any pro bono work. I'm pretty busy. A lot of people say they're innocent, Judge. And he said, no, well, this guy has a strong argument, it looks like, and the DA is willing to help you. So it might be something to look into. So I did. I worked with the Queens County District Attorney's Office back in 2005 together with my office, and we ended up exonerating Angelo Martinez. That was the first case. And so ever since then, which was about 2005, I just started getting lots of requests for help and, kept working in the wrongful conviction area.
Start with asking you to say your name and to introduce yourself.
My name is Derrick Hamilton. I am the Deputy Director of the Perimeter Center of Legal Justice at Cardozo School of Law, and also a co-founder of the Family and Friends of the Wrongly Convicted.
Yeah, my name is Jeffrey Deskovic, and I'm the founder of the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit organization. We free people who are in prison for crimes that they did not commit, and we also do policy work aimed at preventing that from happening in the first place.
Do you mind, saying which case?
So let's see. This case is Calvin Bouari. That's a Bronx case that I was actually arguing at that time. Mm-hmm. And this is the day we got him out from Greenhaven Correctional Facility. We actually had found the real killer, mm-hmm. and was able to vacate his conviction. This is Emil McDowell, who we got out in March of 2023. He did 19 years for a murder he didn't commit. We gave the case to the Conviction Review Unit in Brooklyn, and the real killer, who we told him who it was, the real killer came in with a lawyer and confessed to the crime, which never happens. This is Andre Brown. We got him out December 2022, but now the DA appealed the vacatur of his conviction. He did 23 years of a 40-year sentence for attempted murder, and now they're looking to put him back in for the last 17. Now the appeals court reversed his conviction, so he's supposed to go back to prison Friday. We're fighting hard to keep him out. This is David McCallum. Exonerated him in 2014. He did 29 years for a murder he didn't commit. He was 16 when he went in, and we got him out. This is his first steps of freedom after 29 years in prison. His co-defendant, Willie Stuckey, who was also 16 when he went into prison, we exonerated him as well. But Willie passed away while in prison after he did 17 years. And so we had his mother stand in for him when we vacated his conviction. And then these three relate to Andrew Krivak. Andrew was 17 when arrested for rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl back in 1996. We got his conviction vacated, and then the DA decided to retry him. And so myself and Karen Neuwirth, my co-counsel in that case, retried the case in February of 2023. And the jury, this is their verdict, returned a not guilty plea, so he was acquitted and exonerated. That's him hugging his dad after he spent, and his sister, after he spent over 24 years, 26 years, excuse me, in custody for a case he didn't commit.
Exonerated about 9 people in 10 separate cases over the past 16 years. Can you share insights into 1 or 2 cases that were particularly impactful to you?
I think of the many cases that I've worked on, the one that was most impactful to me was the case of David McCallum and Willie Stuckey. David and Willie were 16 years old when someone randomly identified them as having committed this terrible crime. David had tried to get lawyer after lawyer, literally wrote 400 letters trying to get legal help. And then I got a call from Reuben Hurricane Carter, who was the godfather of wrongful conviction. Reuben was the top contender for the middleweight championship of the world when him and John Artis were falsely accused of a double homicide in Paterson, New Jersey. After Reuben got exonerated, he formed the First Innocence Project in Canada, first Innocence Project in the world. He formed it in Canada. And he asked me to get involved in David's case after he read about one of my exonerations. So that case became very personal to me because, first of all, I got to work with Reuben Carter, who is an absolute legend and a wonderful person, brilliant. Secondly, it took 10 years of a lot of work, investigation, tracking down witnesses, trying to see if there was DNA evidence. So it was a case that we lived with for well over 10 years. And David became part of my family and still is. A matter of fact, we're getting together next week. So over all these years, I exonerated him in 2014. We've maintained, contact. His co-defendant unfortunately died while he was in prison after serving 17 years. And we always insisted that if David was going to be exonerated, we had to exonerate Willie too, because he also was innocent. And so we worked hard to prove that neither of these 2 young men had anything to do with it. That case really, really stuck with me because it showed how little evidence it took for them to get convicted. There was nothing. The police coerced a 3-minute confession out of them. The confession didn't match the physical crime, so if any good lawyer would have looked at it, they would have seen that the confession couldn't be true, because the way the 2 boys really, described the shooting is not the way the bullet was in the victim's body. Or it couldn't physically have happened that way. And would have been very easy to prove that.
Well, once I was able to secure an interview with you, I spent a lot of time doing research, and I found a lot of news articles around you. I found foundations writing about you, and I believe that it's important for other people to tell their stories, but sometimes people should have their ability to tell their own stories. So do you mind telling me your story?
No, not at all. I mean, do you want a summary? How much detail do you want?
You can go as far detailed as you're comfortable into.
Okay. So in 1990, I was 16 years old, and a classmate in Peekskill High School, where I attended, was found murdered and raped. It was a small city, population of approximately 25,000 people. Murders were pretty rare. So when this when this murder happened, it created an atmosphere of fear, rumor, paranoia. Parents were concerned with their own safety as well as the safety of their children. In high school, I was quiet. I was to myself. I didn't participate in a lot of organized sports. This made me seem strange to the kids in the high school. In the course of the police investigation, the police interviewed many students from the school. Some of them told the police that they might want to speak with me because I didn't quite fit in. This is what got me on the police radar. I was also a sensitive teenager, and this was my first brush with death, and I had an emotional reaction. And the police thought that my emotional reaction was disproportionate to what my actual relationship with the victim was, which is to say no relationship. She was in 2 of my classes as a freshman, 1 as a sophomore. I knew her name, she knew mine. That was really the extent of it. We weren't even really on a high-buy basis. Lastly, the police got a psychological profile from the NYPD, which purported to have the psychological characteristics of the actual perpetrator, and I had the misfortune of matching that. So it's a reinforcing factor. So for the next 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me, in which half the time they would speak to me like I was a suspect, and the other half the time they would pretend to need my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me opinion questions and then, congratulate me that my opinion was correct. They made me feel important. Prior to being a teenager, the career that I fantasized about having when I grew up was to be a cop. So to be this unexpected early opportunity to do this quasi-police work, along with my age, 16, was how they were able to pull the wool over my eyes as to the absurdity that a 16-year-old would be able to assist with a homicide investigation. I came from a single-parent household. My father was never involved in my life in any aspect, and that intersected with the good cop, bad cop technique, otherwise called Mutt and Jeff, in which one officer takes on a more aggressive role and his partner pretends to be a friend, but who's powerless to intervene. The purpose, of course, this technique is when the person being questioned becomes frightened, it's only natural that you'd look to a friendly face for assistance. So in time, I began to look up to the officer who was pretending to be my friend as a father figure. Eventually, they got me to agree to take a DNA test. They said that there was some new information that had come into the police file. They wanted to share that with me, and that would allow me to be even more helpful to them. First, though, I would have to take and pass the polygraph. So the next day, rather than report to the high school, I went to the police station. Because it was a school day, my mother and grandmother thought I was in school, and therefore they did not have any idea that anything was wrong, and so they didn't call around looking for me. But they drove me from Peekskill, which is in Westchester County. They drove me 40 minutes away by car to the town of Brewster, which was in Putnam County. The reason why that's important is that meant I was no longer able to leave on my own. I was instead totally dependent upon the police. There were 3 officers who came with me from Peekskill. They put me in the car by myself with the officer pretending to be my friend. And then the bad cop and the lieutenant was in a different car, so the mind games continued. And they brought me to the office in Brewster. The polygraphist himself was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator, and he was dressed like a civilian. He never identified himself as law enforcement. He never read me my rights. We didn't have an attorney present. They didn't give me anything to eat the entire time I was there. They gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked, but it had a lot of big words in it that I didn't understand. But I figured, well, because I'm there to help the police, what does it matter? Let's just get on with it. From there, he put me in a small room where he gave me countless cups of coffee. Seems clear in hindsight that the purpose of giving me all the coffee was to get me nervous. And then he literally wired me up to the machine. And then he launched into his 3rd-degree tactics. So he raised his voice at me. He invaded my personal space. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. And he kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours. As each hour passed, my fear increased in proportion to the time. Towards the end, he made a statement. He said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph results that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And that really shot my fear to the roof. And at that point, the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me. He was holding them off, but that he could not do so indefinitely, that I was going to have to help myself. Then he added that if I did what they wanted, that not only would they stop what they're doing, but that they could go home, that I could go home afterwards, that I was not going to be arrested. Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, I wasn't thinking about the long term. I was just concerned with my safety in the moment. So I took the out, and I was overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically. I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was and that nobody else knew where I was either loomed rather large in my mind. So I took the out which he offered, and I made up a story based on the information they gave me that day in the 6 weeks run up to it. By the time it was all said and done, I had collapsed in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Obviously, I was arrested. The interrogation was not videotaped, it was not audio taped, there was no signed confession. It was just the cop's word for it. And when they came to court, they left the threat and false promise out of their story.
Up in the housing project, you had to fight for everything: pair of sneakers, your basketball, your bike if you had one. And I immediately became scarred by that, and became caught up into that tough era, and it ultimately led me to being arrested for a robbery that put me on the radar of the police, a robbery that I did do. And from that point, I was always being stopped and harassed and searched and stigmatized by police officers, which ultimately led up to me being arrested when I was about 17 years old for a murder, a first murder that I didn't commit. And I learned early on through that process. I went to trial, I was convicted. And I learned early on how unjust the criminal justice system really was, because a person came in and told the judge that she was forced by the police to identify me in a crime, and that she refused to testify. She said, I'm not gonna get up there and do it. The police made me go in the grand jury and say this guy did something he didn't do. I'm refusing. I'm not gonna come in court and take a stand and lie and jeopardize this man's life. The judge had told the prosecutor at that time that they had overnight to decide how they was gonna reconcile that case without this evidence. He said the next day he was gonna dismiss the case if they didn't have something. Very next day we came back to court and the judge ruled that he felt me or somebody acting on my behalf had got the witness to come in and say those things. So therefore, he would find that I waived my right to confront the witness, and he would use her previous testimony in the grand jury as evidence against me at my trial. So for people that may not get it, what the judge actually did was told the prosecutor that day that he was gonna allow them to convict me and take away my right to have the jury hear the real reason why the witness wasn't here. He was gonna read her previous testimony in as evidence, and we wouldn't have an opportunity to tell the jury nothing about why she's not here, what she told them that she never seen it, threatened them. And I was convicted based on that, the legal activity of the judge. Some 4 or 5 years later, the appellate division second department reversed the judge and found that he had made a fundamental error, that he couldn't violate my rights in that matter and convict me without giving me a right to fight back, take away my defense mechanisms. And the conviction was overturned. But I learned about the process early on, and how the process really doesn't work for black people, because you don't have money, you don't have the ability to hire the best lawyers, to get the best investigators, to get the best experts, and you're usually convicted, and then you're usually fighting from behind. So that was my experience early on. I got out after doing 6 years on that particular case. 8 months later, I was arrested for another murder, this time by the detective, a famous detective by the name of Louis Scarcella, as I told you about, who 20-something people have been exonerated based on his sloppy framing them for crimes they didn't commit. And I was subjected to another trial, and I was convicted on a single witness again, who told the jury that she'd seen me come to her building and shoot her boyfriend inside the vestibule of the building. Never happened. Her boyfriend was killed outside on the sidewalk with 2 different guns, not the one single gun she says he saw me use. In any event, later on it was revealed that this detective had told her to say that I committed the murder, had threatened to lock her up, take her kids away from her, and told her that she would go to jail if she didn't say this. And in fact, she told the detective immediately at the crime scene that she didn't see the murder, that she was at the store around the corner, and when she came back, her boyfriend was already dead. Which coincides with the fact that she didn't know how the crime happened. She didn't know he got shot outside. She didn't know it was 2 different guns. She didn't know any of that. And that's the case that I told you about, where I was exonerated on in 2015. And when the appellate division made the landmark decision saying that innocent people should have the right to have the evidence heard, no matter what.
Mistaken witness identification is somebody misidentifies someone. They say it's you, and it turns out to be not you, and you look like the person. They just made a mistake. That's what that is. False confession, the person confesses, and it's false. They didn't do it. And it can be for various reasons. Sometimes they have mental health issues. Many times they're young and they're malleable and they're easy to coerce. Sometimes people are physically abused. There's a history of physical abuse in Chicago where people were tortured until they falsely confessed. We have false or misleading forensic evidence. This is when either science testing is overstated, misstated, sometimes falsely stated. It includes forensic fraud. A lot of the DNA exonerations, particularly the early DNA exonerations, were in cases where they were sexual assault cases. And back then, before DNA, it was the tests that were done were serology, and it was based on blood type. And it was not an exact science. And there were forensic analysts who would say that it matched when it didn't really match. Or it would say it was the same, and so it had to be the same person, even though, say, 50% of the population had the same blood type. It was just inexact, and then DNA came along. And because most of the sexual assault cases had biological evidence that could be tested, and that's where people started getting exonerated because it was shown that serology was really a very inadequate basis to convict people. Although at the time it was, the best they had. And then we have perjury and false accusation. Perjury is what it is. Somebody lies in court. That's often police officers, but it can be witnesses. People who will lie and say that they saw something and they turns out they weren't even in a position to see it. So they just made it up, or they were coerced by police into lying. And it has to be in court or under oath. False accusation, which is in that same category, is someone who makes a false accusation, but doesn't get to court. So I'm writing up this case today where the person who was accused of murder, his alibi was that he was with his girlfriend at the time of the crime. And the girlfriend has now come forward and said that at the time she gave a statement to police that he wasn't there. And she gave it after they threatened to take away her children, have her arrested, unless she made a statement that implicated him. And so she did it. And this happens. And that was a lie, and she knew it. She never got called to testify. And so it's not perjury, but it's a false accusation. If someone is framed by a police officer, they plant drugs on them and say, these are yours. And the person gets arrested and charged and then pleads guilty. So the officer never testifies. So it's not perjury, but it's a false accusation. He falsely accused you of having drugs when in fact he planted them on you. Then we have official misconduct. And some of these overlap a bit. So a police officer who falsely testifies commits misconduct. Official misconduct includes any act of wrongdoing by a government official. And that can include prosecutors, police, social workers who are part of the prosecution team, forensic analysts. who commit forensic fraud. That's what official misconduct captures. And we have a fairly extensive system that captures the varying actors and the varying types, whether it's withholding evidence, falsifying evidence, testifying falsely, tampering with witnesses, and so forth. And then we have inadequate legal defense, and that's basically where the defense fails to investigate, fails to call alibi witnesses, fails to call expert witnesses, really just falls asleep at the switch, and doesn't do the proper job. This case that I'm working on right now. Basically, this was a case of a man who was, here's the crime. A 15-year-old kid is walking down the street, and a man gets into an argument with a man a few years in his 20s, who's got a pit bull. And the witnesses said that the pit bull attacked the kid, and a tussle ensued. And the guy with the pit bull broke a beer bottle and started cutting the kid. And then when another kid that was a friend of this kid tried to run forward with a stick to defend him, he pulled out a gun and shot this 15-year-old twice and then fled with the dog. So he was identified by 3 witnesses, including the friend of the victim. And this kid died, so it's a murder. And he was convicted based on their testimony. And now, years later, come to learn that the lead detective in the case was corrupt and had a history, and literally scores of cases have been overturned because of his misconduct in coercing false statements and false confessions out of people. And so the kid who went to the kid's defense has now said, I never saw the guy's face. I couldn't identify him. The police hit me, punched me, and told me that I was going to be charged with a crime if I didn't identify him. And they told me which person to identify in the lineup. And he also said that the second eyewitness, he was there when she came out of the lineup, and she said she didn't really know who it was, but she picked who they told her to. So this is witness tampering. It's which is misconduct. It's a form of it's a rigged lineup. Okay, then the police officer. So it's a false accusation by the witness when they testify. That's perjury. And it's perjury by the police officers who explain that everything was hunky-dory in this identification process. And when they, and so that's perjury by the police officers. And it's misconduct on their part in a number of ways. They didn't reveal the truth, and they testified falsely. So that's what I'm going to start ticking all these boxes off. We code recantations. So this 15-year-old who's now, this was 1990. He was 15, and of course, it's 30 years later. So he's recanting, and he says, "No, I didn't, and this is what they did to me. They physically abused me, and so I was 15. I was scared. I went along with it." And so he recants, and so we code the recantation. So this case is going to get perjury, official misconduct.
Totally ridiculous.
With an attorney by his side, at 68 years old, Detective Louis Scarcella repeatedly said in Brooklyn Supreme Court he couldn't remember every detail from an investigation 2 decades ago.
Do you remember the Trevor Vieira homicide?
No.
You mentioned earlier about the misconduct of the detective on your case. How did his misconduct influence your case? And what are your thoughts on the broader implications of his actions?
Well, I mean, the detective misconduct got me convicted. It got me to spend all these years in prison. And not only me, 20 other people that we know. And nothing has happened to him. And then he left the police department and went into the Department of Education and did it to a civilian there. So, I mean, implications is clear that it cost the cities millions and millions of dollars for wrongful convictions. And more than that, public safety was affected because the real perpetrators were still out in society committing more crimes.
Cases that you've helped overturn, what role does systemic misconduct or corruption play? What safeguards could be implemented to prevent these patterns in the future?
In the cases that I've worked on, they've almost all had some form of systemic problem that has led to the wrongful conviction. First and foremost is that we don't train our police officers enough, period. Not in anything. Not in how to gather evidence, not in how to interview suspects, not in how to keep an open mind. You know, for example, Britain has certain rules that we should implement here on how to interrogate. It has to be open-ended questions. It has to be inquisitory, not accusatory, and things of that nature. So we find that once a detective gets an idea of who the suspect is, they think they're infallible. That tunnel vision, you can't get them off of that no matter what. And they'll find any kind of crazy explanation to explain evidence that disproves their theory because they just will not get off of that. So we need to start early in the police academy before they become detectives. And then when they become detectives, they should be trained on keep an open mind. Okay, you have an idea who your suspect is. That doesn't mean you discount. It doesn't mean you close the investigation. And it doesn't mean you stop looking. We should have exonerees meet those people in the police academy. And then when they're becoming detectives, let them see that not keeping an open mind leads to innocent people going to jail. We should have exonerees speak to prosecutors and legal aid lawyers, expose every aspect, judges, to the fact that sometimes the person in front of you didn't do it. And don't ever lose that fact, because again, going back to what we spoke about earlier, that's the purpose of the presumption of innocence. Okay? That is the purpose of the presumption of innocence. We throw that away. Most people, when they sit on a jury, most judges, most DAs presume you're guilty. But imagine if we really thought that the person in that chair was innocent. What level of evidence would we require?
If you could sit down with the prosecutor from your original case today, what would you want to say?
I would say to him, you know, your misconduct was a contributing factor to my spending 16 years in prison. Why did you go ahead with the case, even though there were so many red flags that the confession was coerced and false? Why did you not end the case when the DNA didn't match me? Why is it that you had the medical examiner commit fraud? I mean, come on, him saying he remembered that he forgot. I mean, come on, really? How do you remember that you forgot? Then not turning the information over to the defense that the medical examiner had been complained of by authorities in neighboring counties. I would say all of those. I would say all those things.
Thank you. How do you imagine your legacy?
And I would ask him. I would ask him for an apology as well. As silly as that sounds, it would mean something to me.
False confessions play a very significant role.
Right.
What patterns have you observed in such cases, and how can they be prevented?
So false confessions have been involved in almost a third of DNA exonerations. So the one thing that DNA proved is that people do falsely confess to crimes they don't commit. Like, you wouldn't think that. Like, who would ever say, I did a murder when you didn't do a murder? But police pressure, police deception, pressure, normally involve young people who have been interrogated over a long period of time. The police will tell them, you know, if you tell me this, you're going to go home. We know you didn't do it. We know your co-defendant did it. All you got to do is tell us you were there and that he did it, and we'll let you go. So there's lots of different factors that weigh into false confessions, but we know that they exist. Like I said, by and large, most of them involve young people, but even adults have been proven to have falsely confessed.
I was at the Chicago Tribune. We decided to study false confessions, and we looked at every murder case for a decade in Cook County, which is basically the city of Chicago. And we found about 250 cases where police said that the person had confessed to the murder. And one of two things happened. Either the charges were dismissed or the person was acquitted. And it raises the question of, you know, what happened here, that either a guilty person went free or an innocent person was charged. And to sort of put that into context, 250 cases doesn't sound like a lot over 10 years, but if you divide it up, it's 25 cases a year. And if you can say once every 2 weeks for the last decade, Chicago police have gotten a confession from someone who was never convicted, that tells you that that's something there's a problem. It's reflection of there is a systemic problem going on here.
One of the best ways to prevent that is to insist that the minute a person walks into a precinct with the intent that he's going to be questioned, that be recorded. Very often, they only record the end where the person has now agreed to confess, and now they bring the camera out and he confesses. They don't show the 8 hours, and in some cases 18 hours, and in another one of my cases over 20 hours, that person was questioned beforehand. So now, you know, he's sitting at a table in a room with 2 officers, and he just confesses, and it sounds like it just came naturally, you know, out of him without showing what led to that. So that's the first step. It should be fully documented. And there's a bill pending in the legislature to try to get that done here in New York State. Because right now, that bill exempts murder cases, rape cases, and drug cases, which is basically 90-something% of all the criminal cases pending. So the law doesn't really help. The second thing is, under our Constitution, it's been held that police are allowed to use deception. So most people think if a police officer tells you something, he can't lie to you. But most of these confessions come up when an officer says something like, your co-defendant confessed. He said you did it, and that didn't occur. We have evidence showing your blood is at the scene, and that's not true. In a famous case, a guy named Marty Tankleff, who was arrested for killing his parents, they told him that his father's dying words were, "Marty did it." And that was false. And Marty said, well, my father, I said, I must have blacked out. And he couldn't understand, like, why would his father say he did it? And the police wrote out a confession. And Marty never signed it, because when he finally looked at it and the words, he's like, I didn't kill my parents. I didn't have some kind of, blackout where I, killed my parents. And it came out that the officers had lied to him about that. And he was 17 at the time. And then spent almost that amount of time, 17 years in prison, again, for something he ended up being exonerated on. So police should not be allowed to use deception for juveniles, at the very least. If you're under 18, police shouldn't try to trick you. If you're under 18, even if you don't ask for one, you should have a lawyer there. Because when you're older, you may understand that you want to give up your constitutional rights, but when you're under 18, you don't really understand what all that means. Maybe you see it on television, but you don't really see, like, how could it impact you by not having a lawyer. So if we could say that if you want to question somebody under 18, they have to have a lawyer, even if they say they don't want a lawyer. And I think that will go a long way to protecting young people from falsely confessing. But recording the interview from the very beginning, the minute the person walks into the station, to show everything that happened to that person, is vital. And I think if you really think about law enforcement, if you have nothing to hide, there should be no reason not to do that. If you're going to treat the person fairly, if you're not going to try to physically coerce them or trick them or abuse them, then why not show how you got that person to confess?
Mistaken identification, suggestive identification practices when police officers can show your photo to witnesses in a way that will suggest to them subliminally that you committed a crime. Or just blatant picking you out, saying this is the guy that did it, right? Yeah, this is the guy that did it. You sure? Take a look at him, right? Suggesting to you in that way.
There needs to be more adequate funding for defense. Public defenders are some of the best lawyers in this country, and they're overworked, underpaid, underfunded. The money needs to be appropriated for investigations and testing, and to do the kind of work that needs to be done to properly defend people.
Of all the 9 cases that I've exonerated, most of them, if not all of them, probably never would have got convicted if they had a good lawyer at the beginning. Yes, a lot of what we do, we find new evidence that helps to overturn the conviction. But if that lawyer had really worked that hard at that particular time, they would have seen, like, for example, in the case of David McCallum and Willie Stuckey, where there was a confession, any competent lawyer would have seen that the confession didn't match the autopsy, that David and Willie didn't match the early descriptions of the witnesses. But their lawyer couldn't be bothered. And the system doesn't give enough money to indigent defense. And, we value the Constitution. Here in the United States, we treat it as our founding document, as we should. But we don't really pay attention to the fact that out of the 10 rights in the Bill of Rights, 4 of them deal with fairness to the criminally accused.
Race plays a huge role in those who get wrongfully convicted in America. Black people make up just 13% of the U.S. population, but account for nearly 50% of known exonerees. Black defendants are more likely to get misidentified by eyewitnesses, more likely to face police misconduct, and more likely to be sentenced harshly. The bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the assumptions. Who looks suspicious, who seems credible, who gets believed. Study shows that implicit bias, which is defined as unconscious racial attitudes, influences how police, prosecutors, judges, and even jurors make decisions. How did your experiences prior to incarceration influence your perspective on the justice system?
Prior to incarceration, being a young black male in the Bedford-Stuyvesant community, you would always see the police jump out and search people. You would see them harass and target people in your community for stop and frisk and things of that nature. It influenced me because, one of the things that you always acknowledge as a black man in America, that there's a different value placed upon white life and black life, right? When you go to a white community, you don't see police jumping out and patting down white kids or treating them indifferent. You automatically notice that in being a black young male, right? Knowing your history, knowing the Black Panther Party's history and what black people went through in that era. Civil rights, what Martin Luther King went through, and he was trying to be peaceful. You know that there's a target, right? And then you talk about poverty in the communities we come from, right? The fact that our parents wasn't able to provide the way that white parents were. So all of that affects your ability as a young black male in America prior to going to prison. You know that these social and economic differences exist.
Systemic issues within the criminal justice system do you feel impacts your work?
A lot. I think obviously racial bias plays a big part, especially when that's kind of how the NYPD operates, right? Like, okay, they heard that it was someone from this neighborhood, so it must be a black person or it must be a Latino, and then they just go with that. Like, they don't really care who it actually is. They'll go in with a lineup of all these people that look a certain way, and they're like, that's it. And then I also think just like the culture of the NYPD too, I think there's this big pressure around solving something, and so they care way more about that than they actually care about finding the right individual.
We have published a couple reports on race and wrongful convictions. The most recent one was in 2022, and where our statistics basically showed that black people are just under 14% of the exoneration, or excuse me, of the American population, but make up more than half, about 53% of the exonerations. And basically based on looking from the perspective of exonerations, innocent Black Americans are 7 times more likely than white Americans to be falsely convicted of serious crimes. And, you know, it's more prominent in murder, sexual assault, and drug crimes. And so we see this. It's a focus that, you know, police focus on that. They focus on people of color.
I touched on this in this answer a little earlier. You talked about how you feel racial bias played a heavy role in your case. How does racial bias intersect with wrongful convictions, and what measures can be taken to address this issue?
Systemic racism is at the core of the criminal justice system. And you can only get rid of systemic racism is by removing the isms in the system. For example, you can't have members of the Klan working in court systems. You can't have members of Nazis. You can't have people who have overt prejudices and biases at the helm of the ones who are supposed to give justice. You need more diverse cultural training, right? You need to make sure that people that are sitting on benches and judges come from the communities in which the crimes are happening. You know, you need to have more sensitivity and not have, you know, again, people who are not from communities, people who are from a different lifestyle, people who don't understand the social ills or the implications that have been imposed on Black people, man, in America for so long, are out of touch with our reality, sitting on benches and judging us. So we got to make sure the judges, the people who sitting in them robes, understand that redemption, that public safety, that justice, all those things are hand in hand. And more than anything, they have to understand the culture of a Black person and what was the cause of him committing this crime? Was it poverty? Was it a lack of education, right? You can't have mercy on people that you can't identify with.
Have been informed by the detectives that you wish to make a statement. Come on. You wish to say something?
Yes. Before?
Okay, before you say it, let me just stop you and let me say what I need to say. Let me give you your rights again. You have the right to remain silent and refuse to answer any questions. Do you understand?
Yes.
Anything you say may be used against you in court. Do you understand?
Yes.
You have a right to consult a lawyer now before any questioning and have a lawyer present during your questioning. Do you understand?
Listen to me. Yes. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hurt you, Corey. I am on your side. The whole fucking city is like him.
What safeguards you believe should be mandatory during interrogations, especially for minors?
Yes, I believe that for minors in particular, well, in general, the interrogation should be videotaped from beginning to end. The police should not be allowed to lie, claiming to have evidence that they don't have. And with respect to minors, I think that minors should have to speak to a lawyer to explain their rights to them so that they could decide whether they want to waive their rights and speak to the police without an attorney or not.
I just came to look after Yusuf. Yusuf is not here. You are alone with this in here.
Raymond ran it back up, and that's when the lady turned around and started running real fast.
Okay, when you say they were raping her, how did they get her down to where you found the blood?
They dragged her from her feet. They dragged her by her feet, and they dragged her down the rest.
Don't you want to go home? That's all I want. That's all I want. We can fix this. Let's get you out of trouble, son.
At the time of your arrest, you were just 16 years old. What do you wish people better understood about how the justice system treats minors?
I don't believe that kids should be charged as adults. And in the first place, if an adult and a juvenile commit the same crime, I don't see how that can be treated the same. I mean, where the level of culpability is the same. Kids are more subject to peer pressure. They don't think about the long-term consequences. Their brains aren't fully developed. So I don't think that people should be sentenced the same. Certainly, it's a bad idea to mix kids with adults in prison. I was charged as an adult, as a 16-year-old, and when I was found guilty, I was sent to a men's maximum security prison. So that was very dangerous for me to be put in a prison. I don't believe that a juvenile should be housed with adults. But also, I really didn't understand the legal proceedings that much. My lawyer made the situation worse. He wouldn't allow any adults to be involved in any of the strategic decisions that we had to make, such as, whether I was going to testify or not, or whether we were going to have a bench trial, which is decided by a judge, or we were going to go with a jury trial. So I think that having a trusted adult, in those conversations, would be a help.
As seen in the show When They See Us, minors are especially vulnerable to wrongful convictions. Their brains are still developing, making them more receptive to pressure, coercion, and manipulation, especially during police interrogation. They are often questioned without a lawyer or parent present. Many don't understand their rights, and that's how false confessions happen. Around 11% of known false confession cases involve minors, and the younger the child, the more likely they are to confess to something they didn't do. What are the primary challenges that exonerees face upon release, and what support systems are currently in place to assist them or should be in place to assist them?
When someone gets exonerated, there is no system in place for them. It's the most unusual thing in dealing with these wrongful conviction cases. Because if you're guilty of a crime, you do your time and you get parole. You have a parole officer that you can contact and say, how do I get a driver's license? How do I establish an address? Where can I apply for Medicaid? I don't have a job. How can I get on food stamps? My mother passed away. My father passed away. Where do I go, even? And they have some structure there. Now, I'm not saying that parole is the best system in the world, but at the very least, there's someone they can call. And sometimes they can get into a drug program, they can get them into an employment program, on-the-job training program. They have access to that information. When you're exonerated, they just give you your property and say, good luck to you, and you get out. And so very often we spend a lot of time trying to find them a place to live, get them a quick job, get them some kind of a loan that can support them until they can get on their feet, because there is absolutely nothing in place for them. And so I don't know why we don't have a system where there's an office within parole for people whose convictions got vacated but are not on parole, that they have the same access to programs, to contact information, to guidance that a parolee would.
believe that the compensation laws in place for the wrongfully convicted are adequate? And what improvements do you suggest?
So we're lucky that in New York, there is a compensation system in place. New York was one of the first states to enact a compensation statute for the wrongfully convicted. It's called the Unjust Conviction Act, and it's been in effect since the early 80s. There are definitely flaws in it. For example, you don't get a jury. You bring an action against the state, and it's in the state court, which only hears cases about the state, called the Court of Claims. The judges are appointed by the state of New York. So they're essentially having to decide how much their employer should pay for the wrong that they have, in front of them. And I think it would be better served if juries set that amount. But at least we have that. There are many states that have no compensation statute. So we're working to try to get one passed in Pennsylvania, for example. So I think every state ought to have at least some form of compensation if you could prove that you were innocent and spend time in prison. Secondly, there are certain hurdles in place in New York's own system. For example, one of the lines in the statute says that you can't get compensation if you, quote unquote, caused your own conviction. And so I think that line should be wiped out, because that has kept many people from getting compensation because because they confessed. And that's been held to have, quote unquote, caused your own conviction. Sometimes it was proof that maybe they put up a false alibi. Maybe they didn't say who really did do it. There's been cases in New York where the person was falsely accused, but he knew who did it, and because he didn't tell the police who did it, he couldn't get compensation. So I think that those types of hurdles shouldn't keep you from getting all compensation. Maybe it could be that the judge is allowed to take those things in consideration when deciding how much you should be awarded in compensation.
Reflecting on your journey, what personal growth have you experienced since your exoneration?
Since my exoneration, I think the personal growth that I have, again, every time you win a case, you learn about what went wrong in that particular case. And networking, I've have relationships with a lot of the prosecutors, right, who run these units. I have relationships with a lot of judges. I'm teaching in the Judicial Institute now. I'm in Cardozo Law School now. All these things have happened since my exoneration, so I've definitely excelled and made the right connections, man, to be able to work with different institutions and freeing people.
On your journey, what are your aspirations for the future, both personally and in your advocacy work?
My aspirations for the future personally is to retire and to live well and travel the world and forget about this for a while whenever that time comes. And for the criminal justice system, my aspiration is to make sure that all people receive justice no matter what your creed or color is. And justice means more than just sentencing people to life in prison and saying that they should, because they made mistakes in their lives, that there's no redemption.
Do you imagine your legacy?
My legacy is how I reached back to free people in the same position that I was once in. that my life was all about that and all about working to make the justice system more accurate to prevent what happened to me from happening to others. You know, and that you know, I worked to make a difference.
Thank you.
And I did the best that I could in difficult life circumstance. And lastly, I would like to be looked back on and remembered and reflected on as I was, at the end of the day, everything else being just details. I consider myself to be I look at myself to be as a fighter for civil rights. And so I would like to be remembered as, you know, living, breathing, and working in the same manner of, you know, civil rights giants that have gone before me. Whether that was people that use the legal system or, you know, people that educated the public and spoke, and pamphleteering to grassroots tactics. There's many giants throughout the history of our country and the world that have engaged in one aspect or another of those forms of advocacy, and I utilize all those aspects of it, and so I would like to be thought of as, you know, part of those people.
What are you still fighting for that hasn't been achieved yet?
Freeing the clients whose cases are still pending, freeing more people that are wrongfully imprisoned, passing more legislation in, you know, New York that would lead to, you know, prevention of future wrongful convictions, but other states that we're doing policy work in as well. California, Pennsylvania, where we're fighting to pass exoneree compensation. Having a chapter of the Deskovic Foundation in each state and ultimately each country, because I really see this as a worldwide issue, a worldwide problem. So those things have yet to be achieved. I'd love to have my public profile increased, you know, more, and ultimately I would love to have like a book and have a book published and a movie as well, because I could see those things as tools to raise awareness about wrongful conviction and to, you know, facilitate passages of more laws and, you know, let's reach the judges. And I think if we could just have judges be open-minded on cases and just fairly, you know, evaluate legal arguments and facts instead of, you know, the knee-jerk reaction to, you know, find a way to preserve a conviction, you know, rubber stamping and, you know, trying to decide cases in as narrow a manner as possible.
The reality is that all of these wrongful conviction cases, the ones you win, and even more so the ones that you don't win, just stay with you forever, because they're all a horror show. Every single one of them is a tragedy, and in its own right. Even though you get the person out, they don't get their time back. It destroys their family. It destroys their future, their lives. It just, you know, one's more horrific than the next.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And until every conviction is beyond doubt, we'll keep listening, questioning, and fighting for the truth.
I think the system is operating in the manner it was designed to operate. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution says the only people that can be slaves in the United States are convicted criminals. And I think, again, when you look at these prisons, industrial complex, it's put in neighborhoods to give job security for people who ordinarily wouldn't have them. Like all these prisons in rural areas where white people that's poor live, and it builds their community, right? So there's a sector of society that feeds off having people locked up, right? And as long as you have a society where one person economical growth is based on the enslavement of another, you're always going to have some bad results. I think that to change the prison industrial complex or the criminal justice system as it now exists, you have to abolish it and create another one, right? One that's about justice, right? One that's about truth, that's about innocence of guilt. And I think that you also need one that's humane, right? One that understands that even a guilty person should be entitled to fundamental fairness and to become whole. Redemption exists in every human being. So I think you got to change the way that the system is. You can't put a Band-Aid on a big cut and think that it's going to solve the problem, but you got to restructure it by abolishing the system that exists and creating a whole new one that's based on justice and equality for everyone.
The system is broken. It's a truth we've heard over and over, not just from experts, but from the very people who have survived its failures. Right now, across the United States, tens of thousands of people sit behind bars for crimes they did not commit. The National Registry of Exonerations has documented over 3,000 exonerations since 1989, and that number continues to grow. But these are just the cases we know about. Studies estimate that between 1% and 5% of the prison population is innocent. In a country with over 2 million people incarcerated, even the lowest estimate means that at least 20,000 innocent people are still locked up. We heard about official misconduct, junk science, racial bias, and coerced confessions. These are not just isolated problems, they are repeated patterns. And when the same patterns keep producing injustice, the system cannot be called just. But in the face of all this, people like Derrick Hamilton and Jeffrey Deskovic continue to fight. These men, and so many others, remind us that hope doesn't die in the cell, that purpose can grow from pain, that justice is not just a courtroom word, it's a responsibility that we all share. So where do we go from here? We fight to change laws. We support organizations fighting wrongful convictions. We push for accountability, transparency, and better legal protections, especially for the people in our communities who are most vulnerable. Every person can understand one thing about wrongful conviction tomorrow. What would you want them to know in 3 sentences or less?
So if I had to say someone in a very short period of time, let's say 3 sentences, what it is I would want them to know about wrongful conviction, the first thing and foremost is keep an open mind and know that it does exist. That people who are innocent in our criminal justice system are getting wrongfully convicted, sometimes even if they confess to the crime that they committed. So that's the first thing. Secondly is that we have to place a value on the rights that are enshrined in our Constitution for the criminally accused. And that we should honor those rights in the same way we honor all the other freedoms that are guaranteed to us as Americans. And then lastly, that should you have the opportunity to sit on a jury in a criminal case, that you should look at that not just as some horrible thing that came in the mail to you, but as a privilege that you have as an American citizen. And frankly, a duty that you owe to your Constitution and to your country the same way that someone who wears the military uniform. And that we shouldn't cast that aside, and that we should fulfill that obligation when we're called upon.
What do you think the general public most misunderstands about wrongful convictions?
I think I think that they don't realize the different ways in which the justice system is broken, where the deficiencies are, whereby innocent people could be arrested for crimes they didn't commit and found guilty. I think that they don't understand that it could happen to them, it could happen to you. And another misconception, which, well, obviously, if you didn't do it, they would not have arrested you for it. Another common misconception. Well, if you didn't do that, you did something else. Or another variation, or you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you were making some life decisions wrong that put you in harm's way. Yeah, sometimes that could be the case. That's certainly not always. But whether you're making wrong life decisions or not, or hanging around the wrong people or not, you should not be arrested and convicted of crimes that you did not commit. And I want to add that I don't think the public understands the public safety aspect of this, which is each time the wrong person is convicted, that means the actual perpetrator is free to strike again. And that's what happened in my case. The actual perpetrator killed a second victim 3.5 years later, who was a school teacher and had 2 children.
I would just like to say to the public that we all should be involved. That, Martin Luther King says injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, right? That we all are in this together. And I think that, when you look at America and what's happening today, more than ever, you would know the need to unite and fight back and to make sure that justice is for everyone.
If you had the chance to talk to your younger self, what would you say to him in 2 sentences?
Don't waive your rights and agree to speak to the police without an attorney. And second, that'll be the first sentence. And the second sentence is that you're going to go through some extreme hardship of being wrongfully imprisoned, but you're going to survive and ultimately be a big difference in the world as a fighter for justice.
Say a few words to your younger self who had just gotten wrongfully convicted for the second time. What would you say to him?
I would say to that younger self to be aware, and to understand that society isn't perfect, but be aware that there is a system out there looking to enslave you, to make you a statistic of the criminal and justice system. So be aware.
Twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning